Although largely ignored by the public while he was alive, Franz Kafka remains a towering presence in 20th century literature. His narratives plunged into profound existential waters, exploring the depths of human alienation, persistent dread, profound disorientation, and the inherently absurd nature of existence. Attempting to neatly categorize this enigmatic author proves nearly impossible, as his writings resist simplistic classification. Countless scholars have sought to analyze his creations through various frameworks, ranging from psychoanalysis and existentialism to Judaism and Marxism. Yet his profound vision consistently defies being narrowed down to any singular perspective. The true enchantment of engaging with his prose lies in the realization that you will inevitably forge your own unique understanding. Recognizing that no single, absolutely correct interpretation exists. Because his literary voice possesses such extraordinary originality, the specific adjective Kafkaesque emerged specifically to encapsulate the distinctly nightmarish, surreal, and deeply illogical atmospheres he conjured. As you navigate his narratives, you frequently encounter a surreal fusion of intense confusion and awkwardness, often manifesting as a seemingly straightforward objective that devolves into an impossibly endless ordeal. Furthermore, his tales frequently feature towering, faceless bureaucracies that operate invisibly above the individual, exerting absolute and unfathomable control over everyday human existence. Born in 1883, this German-speaking author originated from a bourgeois Jewish household situated in Prague, which served as the capital of the Kingdom of Bohemia within the Austro-Hungarian Empire and currently stands as the capital of the Czech Republic. His formative years were marked by profound isolation, fostering a persistent sensation of existing perpetually on the periphery of society. This intense feeling of estrangement stemmed not only from his Jewish heritage during an era of escalating anti-Semitism, but also from his status as a German speaker, residing within a largely Czech-speaking population. A massive influence on the author's creative output was his father, a fiercely independent individual who transcended a destitute, uneducated upbringing to forge a prosperous commercial enterprise. This patriarch embodied a robust, unyielding and supreme authority figure, presenting a stark contrast to his son's inherent timidity and delicate constitution. Unable to comprehend or appreciate his son's artistic endeavors, the elder man aggressively pushed for his heir to emulate his own commercial success, a demand that inevitably sparked severe and ongoing domestic friction. Eventually, the author penned an incredibly extensive document, detailing the psychological mistreatment he endured at the hands of his patriarch, though this missive ultimately remained unsent. In this profound correspondence, he addressed his father's recent inquiries regarding the root of his persistent terror, confessing that he had been entirely incapable of formulating a verbal response at the time. He explained that this conversational paralysis was caused both by the overwhelming nature of the fear itself and by the fact that articulating its origins would require navigating a labyrinth of details impossible to organize in spontaneous speech. He further noted that even by attempting to clarify these complex emotions through written words, the resulting explanation would inevitably fall short of capturing the full reality. Despite the immense emotional chasm between them, the writer genuinely respected his father, harboring a deep admiration for the older man's relentless energy and practical mastery of worldly affairs. Nevertheless, a quiet bitterness simmered beneath the surface, fueled by the relentless pressure to pursue an occupational path entirely misaligned with his true nature. Yielding to these practical demands, he eventually earned a doctorate in law, which necessitated a mandatory uncompensated year of practical service, clerking, within both the civil and criminal judicial systems. Following this grueling apprenticeship, he secured a position within an insurance firm, where his diligent efforts quickly resulted in a series of rapid professional advancements. Unfortunately, the grueling corporate schedule left him entirely drained, severely restricting the precious hours he desperately craved for literary consumption and creation. He brilliantly captured this specific frustration in his tale of Poseidon, depicting the legendary aquatic deity as being so buried beneath bureaucratic documents that he lacks the opportunity to ever explore his own oceans. His day job served as a massive barrier to his authentic calling as an author, forcing him to channel his creative passions deep into the twilight hours. Reflecting on this struggle, he noted that his entire existence had essentially been a series of largely fruitless struggles to create literature, yet failing to engage in this process left him feeling utterly useless and spiritually discarded, constantly battling a devastating lack of personal energy. While he flawlessly executed his external professional obligations during the workday, he continually neglected his profound internal calling, transforming this unfulfilled artistic mandate into a source of unending psychological agony. He articulated that every individual must discover their personal method for escaping the abyss, and for him, that salvation was found exclusively through the act of arranging words on a page. He firmly believed that his continued survival depended entirely on this creative output, rather than on physical recovery or slumber. Ultimately, the meticulous crafting of sentences transformed into a profoundly spiritual exercise for him, functioning essentially as a deeply personal method of prayer. Upon reaching the age of 29, the author was struck by an intense surge of inspiration, composing the entirety of The Judgment in a single, uninterrupted session. Even though the narrative is exceptionally bleak, featuring a patriarch who condemns his own offspring to perish in the watery depths, the creator viewed its genesis as a profound unburdening of his entire being, likening the experience to a spiritual cleansing, an ending, and a subsequent resurrection. It was during this pivotal breakthrough that he finally discovered his true identity, fully embracing his destiny as a literary artist. Although he generated these texts primarily to satisfy a relentless internal urge, his private musings inadvertently evolved into masterworks of profound, global significance. Throughout his years, the novelist navigated a series of failed romantic entanglements, seemingly uncovering a brief semblance of tranquility only as his days drew to a close. A crippling sense of social apprehension and a profound lack of self-esteem plagued him relentlessly, driven primarily by a deep-seated insecurity regarding his own physical form. There were moments when he was genuinely convinced that observers viewed his appearance with absolute disgust, a psychological burden compounded by chronic sleeplessness, severe headaches, and numerous other physical afflictions. In a desperate bid to manage these ailments, he adhered to a rigorous nutritional regimen and engaged in regular exercise, though the overwhelming despair sometimes pushed him to ponder ending his own existence. He expressed this anguish by stating that existence itself was a pure nightmare that he felt more acutely than anyone else, constantly harboring a quiet, persistent suspicion regarding his own humanity. The tragic year of 1917 brought a devastating medical verdict when the author contracted tuberculosis, an affliction that was entirely untreatable during that era. Fast forward to 1924, and the 40-year-old writer found himself physically incapable of consuming food due to the severe progression of the disease in his throat, ultimately leading to his demise from severe malnutrition. He famously conveyed to you and the rest of his audience that while a boundless supply of optimism exists in the universe, it is tragically completely inaccessible to humanity itself. Despite the immense friction that defined their relationship, historical accounts suggest that his domineering father shed profound tears of sorrow during the burial ceremony. While he was still breathing, the notoriously self-critical author allowed only a handful of his manuscripts to reach the public sphere. Among these final releases was the deeply allegorical tale A Hunger Artist, which chronicled the agonizing public spectacle of a performer who voluntarily starved himself inside a confined enclosure for extended periods. As crowds congregated to witness this macabre display, numerous onlookers cynically assumed the performer was secretly indulging, an accusation that filled the fasting man with intense rage. Over time, the fickle masses abandoned the spectacle entirely, leaving the neglected artist to confess on his deathbed that his astonishing feats of deprivation warranted no applause. He admitted that his legendary fasting was merely the result of never discovering any sustenance that appealed to his palate. A magnificent panther took the place of the performer, drawing massive audiences eager to observe the beast devouring its preferred meals. Despite his relentless dedication to his craft, the majority of Franz Kafka's literary creations were never released to the public during his lifetime. He composed his pieces with intense fervor, rarely editing his drafts, yet he would abandon projects the moment they felt disingenuous, frequently leaving narratives unresolved. This very lack of finality serves as a defining characteristic of his genius, proving that he placed no value on widespread recognition. Reflecting on his aspirations, Kafka once noted that his greatest desire was to cultivate a specific philosophical outlook and share it through his prose. He sought to perceive existence with all its vibrant complexities and organic rhythms, while simultaneously understanding it as an absolute void, a fleeting illusion, or a hazy phantom. He melancholically mused that this would have been a magnificent ambition had he only pursued it with the correct intentions. Upon his passing, the author entrusted his incomplete manuscripts to his closest companion and former law school peer, Max Brod, demanding that the pages be incinerated without ever being reviewed. However, as an accomplished and widely published author himself, Brod outright defied these dying wishes, because he recognized an unparalleled brilliance within those pages. Fully grasping the immense cultural worth of these obscure writings, Brod resolved to share them with the world, having previously warned his friend that he would never destroy such masterpieces. Fleeing from Prague to Tel Aviv with nothing but a solitary piece of luggage, Brod miraculously preserved these invaluable texts and subsequently authored the initial biographical account of his friend in 1937. He painstakingly arranged and edited the surviving manuscripts, releasing them to a public that quickly became captivated by their wholly original style. Although modern readers often imagine the creator as a deeply melancholic figure, those closest to him remembered a remarkably amusing individual whose profound wit sparkled exclusively within intimate gatherings. This blend of sorrow and understated hilarity permeates his literature. He would frequently recite his own stories to his inner circle, occasionally becoming utterly incapacitated by fits of laughter. Scholars observe that the comedic elements within his narratives are intrinsically linked to tragedy, generating a profound and respectful sense of elation. The ultimate irony embedded in his philosophy suggests that the agonizing battle to forge a personal identity ultimately produces a soul defined entirely by that very suffering, meaning our perpetual, fruitless quest for belonging is, paradoxically, our true sanctuary. As you explore his literary legacy, your attention will naturally gravitate toward his most celebrated masterpieces, the Metamorphosis, the Trial, and the Castle. First printed in 1915, the Metamorphosis remains the most universally recognized of his tales, famously commencing with the protagonist, Gregor Samsa, stirring from unsettling nightmares to discover his body abruptly changed into a grotesque insectoid creature. Despite mutating into an indescribable colossal bug, this exhausted traveling salesman tragically retains his complete human intellect and emotional awareness. Initially dismissing the horrifying reality as a mere hallucination, he attempts to return to slumber, only to find his mind wandering to the exhausting demands of his nomadic profession, which prevents him from forging meaningful human connections. Although desperate to abandon his soul-crushing career, he remains trapped by the overwhelming financial responsibility of being the sole provider for his household. Long before this physical mutation occurred, the protagonist suffered from profound isolation, a state that is now magnified to an unimaginable degree, as a human mind trapped inside an alien shell. This horrifying predicament directly mirrors the author's own internalized struggles with self-worth and societal disconnection. Upon noticing that he has missed his alarm and is running behind schedule for his shift, the grotesque creature finds himself physically incapable of rising from his mattress. The sheer absurdity of the narrative stems from this stark juxtaposition, pitting an incomprehensibly bizarre metamorphosis against the mundane, everyday anxieties of an employee fretting about office punctuality. When his concerned mother taps at his bedroom entrance, his attempts to respond are reduced to unintelligible squeaks, prompting his relatives to fear he is severely unwell and plead with him to unlatch the lock. Expending an agonizing amount of energy, the transformed salesman hauls his heavy form across the floorboards, suffering physical wounds as he finally manipulates the handle with his jaws. He attempts to rationally explain his tardiness to a visiting supervisor, but the ghastly sight sends the executive running in absolute terror. His own relatives are equally paralyzed by dread, violently forcing the monstrous creature back into his quarters and firmly bolting the door behind him. Forced to adapt, his relatives suddenly assume accountability for their own survival and seek employment, a stark contrast to their previous willingness to passively drain his income without offering any genuine familial warmth. In reality, they functioned as the true leeches within the household, a tragic irony that the dutiful son never once protested. Meanwhile, the metamorphosed protagonist discovers a sudden revulsion toward the fresh meals supplied by his sister, craving only decomposing garbage to satisfy his new biological urges. He simultaneously develops a strong affinity for the shadows, finding strange comfort in scurrying along the vertical surfaces and overhead plaster of his confined space. Yet, despite his changing instincts, he desperately clings to his lingering love for his relatives and the cherished furniture they begin stripping from his room in an attempt to accommodate his sprawling form. As he struggles to balance his human memories with the overpowering primal compulsions of his current anatomy, his outward actions increasingly resemble those of a mindless beast. Consequently, his parents and sibling engage in agonizing debates over whether any trace of their loved one survives within the repulsive creature. You can hardly imagine a crueler fate than being stuck inside an alien vessel, completely powerless to assure your terrified family that your original identity remains intact, thereby generating a chilling mental chasm between his consciousness and his physical reality. Overwhelmed by their unprecedented circumstances, the household spirals into absolute hopelessness, convinced that the universe has cursed them with a tragedy entirely unparalleled in human history. His desperate father repeatedly voices a wish for mutual comprehension, clinging to the fading possibility that his child's intellect still operates behind those multifaceted eyes, while his grieving mother weeps for her doomed boy. Trapped in a prison of silence, the isolated protagonist silently agonizes over his inability to convey his internal torment to those he loves, realizing that no one will ever comprehend the invisible anguish tearing him apart from within. To me, it remains completely inexplicable. Yet the young woman manages to persuade her mother and father that this creature is merely a leech, a profound nuisance that simply exacerbates their monetary struggles. She argues vehemently that the monstrous bug retains none of Gregor's humanity, insisting that the genuine man would have recognized their plight and departed voluntarily, allowing his relatives to move forward and honor his memory peacefully. Consequently, the household increasingly abandons the transformed salesman, leaving him to starve and endure multiple painful afflictions. Recalling his relatives with profound affection and tenderness, he realizes his departure is necessary, perhaps even more acutely than his sister desires. Observing the gradual dawn breaking beyond his window, he releases a final, feeble exhalation. The narrative concludes with his relatives expressing a fleeting sorrow before abandoning their occupational duties for a day of rest. Bright, cheerful sunlight pierces the gloom of their previously oppressive living quarters, instilling a palpable optimism for what lies ahead. Released to the public after the author's passing in 1925, the trial presents a fractured narrative, as the writer abandoned the manuscript in disarray, leaving its definitive structure forever shrouded in mystery. The arrangement of the segments you read today relies entirely upon the organizational choices made by Brod. The tale begins with the assumption that malicious slander has targeted Josef K, leading to his unjustified detention on an otherwise ordinary morning. Dawn breaks on his 30th year, and the central figure, a banking official, awakens to discover a pair of unfamiliar, dark-clad figures intruding upon his bedroom. A commanding voice from the adjacent chamber suddenly barks his name, initiating a bewildering questioning session where the official learns he stands charged with a completely ambiguous offense. He possesses absolutely no knowledge regarding the identity of his accusers or the jurisdictional power orchestrating this event. The presiding inspector casually reveals that the personnel present are insignificant cogs in the machine, completely ignorant of the underlying details and merely acting on orders from higher echelons. Paradoxically, despite this official detainment, the captive is permitted to attend his job and continue his daily routines without physical restraint. A phone call eventually alerts the accused that a preliminary inquiry regarding his situation is imminent. However, he receives no specific appointment time and acquires only the vaguest directions to the venue. Unsurprisingly, navigating the labyrinthine structure to locate the tribunal proves incredibly difficult, forcing him to scour the premises level by level. It becomes apparent that the authorities are handling his predicament with bizarre apathy. Upon finally discovering the makeshift courtroom hidden within a garret, the assembly immediately reprimands him for his tardiness. He passionately declares his conviction that a massive, systemic apparatus operates behind the tribunal's rhetoric, driving both his initial capture and the current hearing. This apparatus, he argues, relies not just on degenerate guards, foolish overseers, and inquiring judges of meager standing, but it heavily funds an elite judicial tier, complete with an endless horde of subordinates, clerks, constables, and possibly even executioners. He boldly questions the ultimate objective of this sprawling bureaucracy, asserting to the room that its primary function is to apprehend guiltless individuals and subject them to meaningless, utterly unresolved legal battles. Josef K grapples with the nonsensical obligation to prove his innocence without ever comprehending the charges levied against him. He soon uncovers that the legal texts utilized by the tribunal are littered with obscene illustrations, revealing the true nature of those presiding over his fate. Confronting such insurmountable barriers inevitably plunges you into profound hopelessness. The judicial hierarchy stretches infinitely upwards, baffling even those deeply entrenched within its ranks. You might marvel that a standard human lifespan could ever afford enough time to accumulate the expertise required to effectively challenge this colossal institution. The system constantly claims to be moving forward, yet the specifics of this advancement remain perpetually obscured. You find yourself trapped in a paradoxical nightmare. Ignorance of the regulations guarantees culpability, yet even a comprehensive understanding of the statutes results in condemnation if every microscopic stipulation is not flawlessly executed. Throughout this ordeal, the banking official must maintain his professional facade, desperately attempting to conceal his predicament despite the growing whispers among his colleagues. Seeking insight, he calls upon Titorelli, an official portrait artist possessing profound familiarity with the tribunal's internal machinations, who reveals a commissioned depiction of a magistrate. Looming over the judicial figure is an entity meant to embody equity, simultaneously representing the deity of triumph. Curiously, this allegorical character is depicted in mid-stride, disrupting the equilibrium of the symbolic scales. Upon closer inspection, the accused observes that the image strongly resembles a divine huntress. Through this visual metaphor, the author implies to you that the judicial system, while loudly proclaiming its dedication to fairness, is fundamentally obsessed with pursuing its prey and securing domination. Despite the protagonist's clear innocence, Tittarelli concedes that the tribunal rigidly adheres to its initial presumptions of guilt, and the supreme authority remains forever unreachable. The institution simply refuses to be swayed by any factual evidence. More precisely, the system actively ignores any exonerating information submitted during its own proceedings. Absolute absolution is a myth. You can never truly eradicate the impending allegations, though leveraging interpersonal connections might delay the ultimate judgment, creating an illusion of provisional liberty. In this transient state, you distance yourself from the indictment, yet the threat lingers perpetually, ready to ignite the moment a directive descends from the upper echelons, as the institution possesses a flawless memory. Josef K must continually endure questioning and attend hearings, keeping the bureaucratic wheels turning to project an outward facade of productivity, all of which amounts to a grand theatrical performance. Furthermore, his legal counsel proves utterly inept, offering hollow assurances of eventual victory and vague claims of momentum, while simultaneously emphasizing the monumental obstacles blocking their path. These relentlessly repetitive tactics are deployed solely to manipulate the accused, offering fleeting illusions of salvation while simultaneously torturing him with formless anxieties. Ultimately, the troubled man arrives at a grand basilica, intending to escort a significant business associate. The anticipated individual fails to appear, leaving an empty void. As dusk settles and the protagonist prepares to depart, a resonant voice calls out to him. A clergyman from the penitentiary approaches, bearing the grim news that a formal summons has been issued, and his culpability is now viewed as an undeniable certainty. To illustrate this dire predicament, the holy man shares an allegorical tale. In this story, a formidable doorkeeper is stationed right outside the gates of the law. A man from the country approaches this sentry, politely requesting permission to step inside, yet he is met with an immediate refusal. Pondering his options, the traveler inquires if future access might be granted, to which the doorkeeper concedes that such a thing remains a possibility, just not at this current moment. The sentry even dares the man from the country to trespass against orders, but swiftly warns him that countless other guards lurk beyond, each possessing a terrifying strength that dwarfs the one before him. Utterly blindsided by these immense hurdles, the man from the country is paralyzed. The law, after all, is universally understood to be available to anyone at any given moment. Rather than forcing his way forward, he chooses the passive route, resigning himself to sitting by the entrance until authorization is finally granted. He lingers on that very spot for countless years, watching his youth fade away as his vision slowly deteriorates into shadowy uncertainty. Despite his failing eyesight, he eventually notices a brilliant, eternal glow piercing through the gloom from within those elusive gates. Throughout his agonizing vigil, the man from the country becomes obsessively fixated on this single doorkeeper, mistakenly believing him to be the sole barrier standing between him and the law. As his body withers away, his decades of patient lingering boil down to a single, unasked query regarding why no other soul has ever approached this specific gateway. Hearing this, the doorkeeper recognizes that the old traveler is drawing his final breaths and bluntly roars the devastating truth. He declares that this particular doorway was constructed exclusively for the dying man, and now the time has come to shut it forever. The tragic irony lies in the fact that the man from the country perpetually awaited authorization rather than actively seizing his right to cross the threshold. The doorkeeper had actually laid out the option to push forward, albeit with the heavy caveat that fierce battles would inevitably follow such a bold move. One could argue that the protagonist surrendered his agency to a misleading authority figure rather than trusting his own inner resolve. Conversely, this paralysis serves as a sharp condemnation of administrative red tape, illustrating how an oppressive establishment completely alienates individuals within modern society. Even if he had successfully bypassed the first obstacle, an endless sequence of increasingly intimidating doorkeepers would have instantly blocked his path. Regardless of how you analyze the tale, the imperishable glow escaping from those shadowy doors suggests that a tiny fragment of optimism still lingers in the void. Returning to the main narrative, two strangers arrive at K's residence on the very eve of his 31st birthday. Fully aware of his impending doom, he offers absolutely no physical resistance to his captors as they escort him to a desolate quarry for his brutal execution. He utters a final, agonizing comparison to a slain hound, cementing a profound sense of humiliation that seems destined to outlast his physical demise. This literary masterpiece simultaneously projects a surreal, nightmarish hallucination while remaining deeply anchored in a terrifyingly grounded reality. Many consider the text a grim foreshadowing of totalitarian regimes, accurately predicting the rise of heavily monitored, dystopian civilizations. That sudden morning knock, which triggers the relentless dread permeating the entire story, perfectly symbolizes the unseen threats silently waiting to ambush you in your daily life. In a metaphorical sense, you are constantly facing judgment within a societal framework. Franz Kafka flawlessly captured the agonizing administrative nightmares and terrifying regulations that heavily define our 21st century landscape. A deliberate, robotic detachment drives the narrative voice, mimicking a government clerk documenting unspeakable horrors with chilling bureaucratic indifference. Kafka would never have possessed the insight to craft such an oppressively accurate fictional world without his background as an insurance claims investigator. Interacting intimately with the labyrinthine legal framework is a guaranteed method to rapidly transform you into a profound cynic. This theme continues in his final, incomplete manuscript, The Castle, which finally saw publication after his death in 1926. Here, another protagonist named K arrives as an appointed land surveyor, only to discover that physically reaching the titular fortress is an absolute impossibility. Upon entering the local settlement, the surveyor quickly learns that residing among the locals is strictly forbidden without official clearance from the shadowy fortress above. He exhausts every conceivable method to establish communication with the very officials who demanded his presence, yet his efforts continuously hit an invisible brick wall. Eventually, word trickles down that his initial appointment was merely the result of a ridiculous administrative error. The daily operations of these invisible authorities remain a complete mystery, with zero transparency regarding their actual functions or goals. Despite this obvious dysfunction, the local residents practically worship these leaders, blindly accepting the illusion of a flawless administrative machine. The mere existence of K's accidental summons completely shatters this myth, proving that deep systemic failures plague their supposedly perfect hierarchy. Striking parallels naturally emerge when comparing The Castle alongside The Trial, as both narratives fiercely examine an individual's fight against an untouchable administrative monolith. These invisible structures govern the masses from the shadows, completely blocking any attempts at direct interaction or accountability. The castle acts as an omniscient observer, effortlessly seeing past the curated social identities you project into the world. Scholars, including the renowned Max Brod, often analyze this unreachable citadel as an allegory for humanity's desperate, eternal quest for divine connection. Ultimately, an overwhelming sense of profound ambiguity remains the beating heart of all these literary creations. Exploring this intentional vagueness, Kafka once penned a reflection noting how people frequently dismiss philosophical wisdom as useless riddles that offer zero practical solutions for your daily survival. When a visionary instructs you to cross over, they are not pointing toward a physical destination that you could easily map out and travel to. Instead, they are gesturing toward a mythical, undefinable realm that even the visionary cannot clearly articulate, rendering the advice practically useless for navigating your earthly struggles. These metaphorical tales ultimately serve only to confirm that the unknown is simply unknowable, a frustrating truth you already understand. Meanwhile, the exhausting, mundane problems you actively battle on a daily basis require a completely different set of practical tools. Through this sobering realization, Kafka fiercely grounds you in the present moment, destroying the illusion of a utopian escape where you might finally secure lasting happiness. He forces the reader to confront the harshness of reality without relying on fantastical destinations as an emotional crutch. Concluding this philosophical thought, he introduces a voice questioning this exact hesitation, asking why you push back so strongly against these hard truths. Imagine a philosophical dialogue where someone proposes that fully embracing allegories would transform you into an allegory yourself, instantly erasing all your ordinary anxieties. When a skeptical listener wagers that this proposition is itself merely an allegory, the initial speaker concedes the bet, leading the skeptic to lament that their victory is purely metaphorical. The first speaker then corrects them, asserting that their triumph is entirely real, whereas, within the realm of allegory, they have actually suffered a profound defeat. Through this intricate meta-parable, Franz Kafka deeply explores the inherent contradictions of human existence, highlighting our powerful desire to discover a magical realm beyond everyday life, even while we suspect such a utopia remains forever out of our intellectual grasp. As his final years approached, the author embraced a much deeper sense of spiritual awareness, observing that human survival relies entirely upon an enduring faith in some indestructible inner core, regardless of whether that enduring element, and our faith in it, stay forever hidden from our conscious minds. Despite the pervasive gloom often associated with his literary creations, he consistently elevates the singular human soul above the crushing machinery of anonymous institutions. Ultimately, the profound wisdom he offers you focuses on the necessity of conducting your life with uncompromising honesty, genuine authenticity, and steadfast moral integrity. Engaging deeply with his literary universe inevitably creates a permanent shift in your perspective, unlocking a completely new vocabulary to articulate the previously indescribable absurdities you face in your daily routine. He fiercely argued that literature must jolt our consciousness, questioning the very purpose of any text that fails to deliver a jarring psychological awakening. In his view, we desperately require narratives that crash into our realities with the devastating force of a catastrophe, evoking a sorrow as profound as mourning our most cherished companions, or enduring the absolute isolation of total exile. He famously insisted that a truly significant piece of writing must act as a brutal instrument, aggressively shattering the icy emotional barriers we have allowed to freeze within our own minds.